of Something or Other Publishing. Wade Fransson is the host of Created in the Image of God, a series that examines the role of religion in society, from messianic returns to the emotive responses transmitted through our culture. Wade fearlessly addresses reality claims from all directions, objectively exploring their compatibility with Holy Scripture. Joining him is Daniel Sanderson, CEO of Planksiv, an international philosophy and cultural media outlet, helping emerging thought leaders with personal branding by co-creating organic content. Tonight's episode: Define Religion.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Created in the Image of God. I'm your host, Wade Fransson, and I'm right here with my compadre, Dan Sanderson. As mentioned in that intro, Dan is the CEO of Planksiv, and he helps people define brand as an international media outlet with a philosophical outlook. And Dan has assisted me in putting this show together. And he's, in a sense, given me enough rope to hang myself because I've been doing this for a year and never really defined my terms. Well, we're going to come to terms in a defining moment right here, right now, with that problem. And we're excited about this show. We're also going to introduce some wizardry in the form of pre-recorded segments. Now, I say that tongue in cheek because we're kind of amateurs at trying to use pre-recorded segments in a live show on a low budget. So just go with it. Just have as much fun with it as we did. But the reason we're doing it tonight is that we have a very special guest who was not able to be with us live in the studio. So kind of like we had to do a few weeks ago with Alan Rabinowitz in Israel, we've pre-recorded our guest, and we'll have a pre-recorded introduction of him in a moment. But first of all, this defining process to define the word religion, for starters, i.e. the show Created in the Image of God, the role of religion in society. We spent a number of episodes talking about what it means to be created in the image of God. Loyal followers who remember those episodes, we worked with various pre-recorded videos around the book of Genesis and the creation story and how God created us in his image, male and female, et cetera, et cetera. And we've woven that theme into a number of shows, but we've never really defined the word religion. What do we mean by religion? And that's how we're going to tackle Mount Everest tonight, is starting with that term. So it won't happen perfectly tonight. It won't happen overnight. It will take several episodes. We'll be revisiting this theme intermittently, but we're going to take a big stab at defining the term religion tonight. More about our special guest in a minute. I first want to invite Dan, who's been sitting patiently listening to me talk. As a philosopher, Dan, what does it mean to define one's terms?
Well, this is almost like a mantra or a starting point, an axiom within a group of philosophers as they get together. Let's define the terms. And I take that with a grain of salt because there are certain terms that you have to leave impregnated in the word. You have to leave it open to continual revision. And to give Wade a compliment for tonight's show and how it will unfold for the audience, it is a dialogue. And as this particular philosopher loves the dialogue as a way of extracting the truth, because the process of having the conversation, as you'll see over a 20-minute conversation, you'll see that the definition unfolds. Okay. And this makes it very different. So it's like you got to practice a little bit of patience to think about the words that we're trying to convey, to think about what our guest is going to try and how he's going to try and frame certain topics and certain definitions, and then how the three of us kind of work through and deliver the message. It's remarkable to see. It's a very natural process. I quite enjoy it.
Wonderful. Well, I do think that defining the word religion is critical, because as we talk about the role of religion in society, what do we even mean? And a lot of people will have a reaction to that. Some will think, we're talking about a theocracy. Some will, welcome that. Some will say, yes, Jesus at his return will introduce that. Others will violently disagree and say, we need to remove religion from society. Religion is the problem. On this show, we're always seeking to bring together. We're always seeking to work with the forces of integration, not the forces of disintegration. What can we agree on? Dan being, not necessarily a believer in the sense of a Christian or a religious believer who believes in a certain holy text delivered, through divine revelation from God himself. And nonetheless, Dan and I have so much in common, and every time we have a conversation, we learn from each other because we are both interested in that integration. And so is our special guest tonight, who I invited to the show. And again, he can't make it, so we've got pre-recorded segments. And he's got, his ambition is so large in terms of his vision for how to change the world, and has devoted his life to it. That Dan took a stab at pre-recording an overview of our guest. So we'll just jump right into that pre-recorded intro, and then we'll immediately jump into the segment with Norlin, in which we seek to define religion. And it's going to happen very fast, because I jump right in and I ask him to define the term, which he does, and then we're off and running. And as Dan mentioned, this was a dialogue that took place. It actually went on for over an hour, and Dan has done a great job at condensing it to 20 minutes for the purposes of the show tonight. And we'll go into that, and then we'll come into maybe we'll stop somewhere in the middle, jump in, do a quick commercial break, come back, finish the video, and then we'll have lots of time for audience participation. So please do put your comments in the chat, even during the live video, so we can come back to them, so we can invite you to participate in this ongoing dialogue on defining terms.
Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to introduce Norlin Dimmitt, embracing the spirit of Fratelli Tutti. Norlin's ecumenical focus seeks to unite Christians in the pursuit of common goals. With over 800 organizations spread across 3 hubs, Norlin collaborates with diverse groups working towards systems change, aligning with focal area movements, call for spirituality, politics, and economics grounded in loving our neighbor and caring for creation. Within these hubs, 2 vital initiatives, Caring Culture and Caring Economy, are bringing cultural and political divides in conjunction with the Partnerships for American Democracy. By uniting Christians and fostering a sense of shared faith and hope, Norlin aims to overcome diversity and work towards an inclusive America that works for all. Norlin's vision extends beyond politics, envisioning a society where every industry and business prioritize people and planet over profit. He encourages compassionate citizens to make conscious choices in their shopping, service, investment, and voting practices, fostering communities, a nation, and a world that prioritize the well-being of all. Recognizing the significance of spiritual well-being, Norlin believes that true love for our neighbor, transcending ego and consumerism, is a key to achieving the highest good. By empowering collective wisdom and compassion, he invites you to join him in creating a better future for all.
What do we mean on this show when we use the term religion?
The definition of religion that does the most work is that set of values and beliefs that we organize ourselves around.
And so what you're saying is that inherently religion implies some change in my behavior, some guardrails around my behavior. In other words, if I'm going to organize my life around those principles, it implies action, it implies decisions, it implies choices. It's not just an intellectual exercise. My head and my hand, I walk the walk. I'm not just talking the talk. Are you saying that that's implied in religion?
I left a word out that's super important, because I said around which we socially organize. So very specifically, it's that set of beliefs and values where that love and belonging phase of Maslow is going to be operationalized, where I am going to be a Southern Baptist because of my alignment, reasonable alignment with the values and beliefs of the Southern Baptist. And so it is very much about the function of social organizing. It has no meaning outside of the function of socially organizing.
So it's not an individual activity.
No.
So it's not, REM song, Losing My Religion, you can lose your individual religion and you can leave that religion, but the rest of the people will continue to socially organize around the principles that you've now abandoned. And
Right.
you're saying that ultimately it's the socially organizing. And as a Baha'i, I would agree, because inherent in the Baha'i definition of religion is a manifestation of God, a Buddha, a Jesus, a Muhammad comes with a revelation, and that revelation spawns a new civilization. For there to be a prophet at the level of Muhammad, right? You have the major and minor prophets in the Bible, and then you have Moses and Jesus who stand above them. To be a Moses or a Jesus, you must generate a civilization. That's the power of a religion versus a sect, let's say. You can have a sect of Jeremiah, a sect of Isaiah, but they're sects of a religion. The order of magnitude of religion would be a Moses, a Jesus that brings a civilizing force.
I want to bring this back to Marxism, the eventuality of socialism unfolding. With your definition, then he would be a false prophet?
You're right. Well, the interesting thing about the Baha'i faith is that John the Baptist announced Jesus, right? The John the Baptist figure of the Baha'i dispensation was a person in Iran called the Bab, who declared who he was in 1844. The same year Karl Marx stated that religion is the opiate of the people. And the Baha'i faith so the Baha'i faith is the only world religion that from a historical perspective, the originator was able to actually comment on Karl Marx and on communism. And the Baha'i faith has declared that communism is a false god, and therefore Marx would be a false prophet. Communism being a false god, partially because it throws out religion entirely. This is my opinion now. It's official that in the Baha'i writings, communism is declared to be a false god. But in my opinion, that's because it throws out religion entirely. It declares religion to be an opiate of the people, and it sets up, therefore, a secular religion, right? Organizing principles, Norlin, your definition of religion might apply to Karl Marx and to communism. Yes. It is a religion, and it is a false religion because it is a religion that is distinctly separate and apart from God.
Right. Can we please use the word incomplete rather than false when we're talking about this distinction? Because the whole problem of dualism and everything, the halo effect, good, bad, black, white, is that as opposed to what? Which true prophet? Who got it right? Because I don't think Jesus did. I don't think Buddha did.
No, Norlin, I'm happy to, but I want to establish for my Baha'i listeners and for anyone else who wants to know about the Baha'i faith does declare communism to be a false god.
So there was an incompleteness by saying religion. Obviously, he has a narrower definition of religion. If we're agreeing here that his ideology would fit into my definition, which is any ideology itself is a religion, right? If you have right-wing conservatism is a religion. This is a set of values around which we organize ourselves. We go to the polls. That's good enough. I mean, the incompleteness certainly I would buy, and there's such a huge quantum difference between Leninism and Marxism. They are so night and day in terms of what Marx actually talked about.
Could you unpack that for me and our audience? Could you just quickly delineate the distinction between Marxism and Leninism?
So Marxism is, in fact, a totalizing version. It's an autocratic step, supposedly, towards the true emancipation, the emancipatory politics that Marx preached was turned on its head by Lenin, who said, well, we want to give freedom to everybody and liberty and democracy and all that, but you guys are way too stupid and way too morally unevolved. So we're just going to mandate that you work your ass off and we're going to share the fruits of your labor with everybody and this collective idea. So we have this absolute reversal of the democratization process that Marx envisioned, and it becomes totalitarianism. And so It's a complete opposite of what Marx actually preached.
Thank you. And so let me now clarify so that I don't get into too much hot water. To say that the Baha'i faith specifically calls out communism as a false god is not necessarily to say that Marx was a false prophet, right? It's my opinion that because of Marx's comment, religion being the opiate of the people, among other things, I don't want to conflate my opinion with the Baha'i faith, because that's a cardinal sin and very dangerous. And I want to be clear that, I'm talking my opinions, and for a live show and a recorded show, I want to make that distinction. But communism is is something, that includes Leninism, correct? So communism would be a mix of Marxist ideology and Lenin's doctrine, if you will, that you just defined, that then forms, a state or a policy of a state.
Except not. So Acts 2, just to bring the Christian theology into this a bit, but Acts 2 communism, which was absolutely communism. There's no other way to characterize sharing and sharing alike among one another. And it doesn't say democratic decision making, but there's some sense in which things were a bit more democratic before the council of Nicaea.
For the audience, let me clarify. Acts 2 communism was when the church in Jerusalem, people started selling their property and putting into a common pool where.
And I agree with that, but there are examples that have worked out, and it's slow and it's unbelievably slow path to what my vision is. But for example, there's a community of Mennonites. 1957, they launched what's called Reba Place Fellowship, and there's a few dozen people after all these years, but they have thrived and they have built apartment buildings to house the homeless and the disfranchised. But Acts 2 communism there was not nearly as much global GDP per capita in those times as there is today. So we live in a different world where Acts 2 communism can be actualized.
As a Baha'i, I would have to say we'd have to clarify, a distinction, because I do believe that communism is a false god. And again, that I would define that as the belief that you can get there without God. So I'm going to take a quick break there. And thank you, Dan, for splicing that conversation together. For the audience, that was a live conversation. This was rolling quite quickly. Dan's made it move even more quickly. But one key comment was cut out when I was saying, for the audience, I want to clarify what Norlin meant by Acts 2 communism. Is when in the book of Acts, the early Christian church in the first century, in a sense, did an experiment, right? They launched off on a communistic approach in which everything was pooled, and it was people sold their property and gave up personal ownership in order to pool everything. And what I commented on, which was cut out, is that later you read about Paul the apostle taking up a collection for the poor saints at Jerusalem, right? In other words, the experiment with a communistic approach failed in the early Christian church. And we could have religious scholars and historians, comment on this. But what happened, based on the historical record as recorded in the Bible, is those same saints that decided that would be a good idea, it collapsed, it failed. In a microcosm similar way in which, in my opinion, the experiment with communism in the Soviet Union failed. And for the record, again, I traveled in the Eastern Bloc countries during the Iron Curtain era. At that time, East Germany was considered the 10th largest global economy in terms of real GDP, gross domestic product. But it was all inflated and artificially kept together. When the reunification happened between East and West Germany, the West Germans found out just exactly how bankrupt East Germany was. Far, far, far from the 10th largest economy in the world. It was one of the stronger economies in the Soviet bloc. But there was extreme poverty and bread lines that were systemic throughout the entire Soviet Union. When President Reagan called tear down this wall, and put pressure on them through whatever sanctions, it's like, make your model work, show that it works. But it didn't work. It did not produce all the things that it promised. So it was a false utopia. My cousin in Sweden used to joke, and that's the Baltic Sea separates Sweden and Russia and Poland. And he said, you see those submarines in the Baltic Sea, they are making sure that people from the West cannot get into the workers' paradise, right? They're patrolling the border to make sure that all the Westerners who want to get into the workers' paradise can't get in there. And it was, to me, hilariously funny because it it so clearly showed the ridiculousness of this idea of a worker's paradise where nobody has enough to eat, their houses can't be heated, they're starving to death, they're standing in bread lines, and yet this is supposed to be a much better model. Right. That's the what I mentioned to Norlin when he talked about Acts 2 communism, and then he got into examples of where that approach can work. The key point that I was making is the idea of ownership, really, because you got the idea of God is or is not in it. That's one thing. That's why I mentioned Marx with his comment about religion being the opiate of the people. That's one thing. But the other thing is the idea that individuals can't own things. And that changes a lot of dynamics in human behavior. It's a religion, but the question is, does it work, and can it be used to form a healthy, thriving society? I'll stop there and let you comment, Dan.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, like if I forget, please remind me about the civilization factor of your definition, which I think is absolutely incredible and worth emphasizing.
That's not my idea. That's a Baha'i concept.
Okay, so yeah, everything. Okay, well that's good, right? It's out of your hands, right?
Right.
Now, the thing is that I'm a Platonic philosopher. I mean, I think Plato's probably my greatest intellectual and philosophical hero, I guess I would say, right? Now, he advocated for communism as well. And one of the things that
really, in what way communism versus Marxism? I'm not familiar with this particular aspect of
and I think where that seed actually comes from is that there's things like the Noble Lie and the Republic where they say, hey, in order to get a civilizing force, the smarter people or the people in power have to initiate, for the good of the people, they have to initiate a lie, right? Now, I'm not saying that the communist piece was. I think that is
that why some atheists and agnostics can get their head around, sure, believe in a God if you want, because that's a noble, if it's a noble lie, maybe it's going to help.
Yeah, but at its core, at its core, if there's faith without belief, then in and of itself, and then we were getting to the definitions of, something like essence. Well, if you take that out of it, then you remove it from the definition. Is it faith anymore if you don't believe in it, right? And I mean, that's a whole separate conversation, right? But the idea of the idea of communism and the blueprint that Plato put forth for people has been interpreted over the years in various different fashions, right? And even while Plato was alive, he tried to implement his idea of the ideal polis or community or city-state, right? And it didn't work. And I think the power from Plato comes, first of all, from within and from the idea of how we think and how we take abstract thoughts and how they manifest through us, right? But trying to dictate or understand how civilization should be laid out is almost an infinitely more complicated process, right? To try and do that. And it feels to me that we've arrived at this progressive point in history where we say, hey, we've been able to establish something, and there has been civilizing forces at play. Now, arguably, I could say objectively that the hockey stick graph of consumerism has been an accelerant for that type of thing, right? I mean, the wealth that we've been able to extract has done a lot to civilize and pull people out of poverty, right?
Well, and is that a religion, right? Are there religious elements inherent in capitalism in that sense?
Right, and it's just not sustainable. So it has the same effect, but is it then again a false good, right? Is it a false god? And only time will tell, because time is infinite.
I would say it absolutely is, in the same way that communism, both from an economic theory perspective and from the fact that there's a belief that you can do it without divine assistance, is a false god. So capitalism, the idea of a free market, first of all, is an oxymoron, in my opinion. You can't have a market without regulation. You by definition, a market requires some regulation. So even anyway. So the question
Wait,
is,
you have
then,
to think about what you're saying about that. I understand, because you've said that on multiple shows before. You say, well, the free market is an oxymoron, but I don't know if that's the point to focus on. For, like, I know everybody says, well, it's the free market. So you say, okay, yeah, there is regulation, but I think really
the
what
question is
it
always
comes
how
down
much
to is
regulation and which kind
exactly.
of
There's
regulation.
always some
Right.
sort of
Right.
regulation.
That's
and
my point. The point is, the idea of a free
Yeah.
market is an oxymoron, and purists, right? Purists, in that sense, they're like fundamentalists. They're like, and I with a
Yeah.
twinkle in my eye, say that I'm a fundamentalist, but I'm a reasoned, tempered fundamentalist. I'm a fundamentalist that doesn't believe in blind faith, or certainly ignorance, right? And so
Right.
if you ignorantly talk about capitalism versus communism the way I did when I came back from Sweden in 6th grade, and promoted socialism because I liked life in Sweden, and my personal experience in Sweden was better. Getting back to our friend Jason Persoff, the scientist, my personal experience at that time was not valid, right? I liked Sweden and I liked socialism because I had a two parent household actually taking care of me, whereas in capitalist America I did not. And I equated those things in a very binary way with the systems. I think there was actually some truth to it, right? Because brutal, hard, cold capitalism, right, is not nurturing. It's not nurturing in any way, shape, or form, right? But just because you can claim a belief in communism doesn't make you nurturing either, right? As we saw from Stalin, right? So,
Yeah.
what am I getting at here? That yes, capitalism and communism, independent of God and independent of any kind of mitigating, corresponding, balancing beliefs, they are absolutely false gods and false religions. So I didn't mean to elevate capitalism over communism, but I do believe that the idea of personal ownership is inherent in the idea of religion. That was my comment earlier with Norlin about my hand and my head must be in alignment.
Yeah.
If I don't take personal ownership of that which I profess, I can profess anything I want. I can profess my belief in Jesus. I can profess my personal relationship with Jesus. No one can prove or disprove whether I have a personal relationship with Jesus, but Jesus himself said, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not the things that I say? Anyway, we jumped off of the recorded track partially because I wanted to clarify that, but also because I wanted to go to a commercial break, which we'll do here in a second. But because I've been somewhat dominant
two
here,
more
please.
civilization forces to think about. So the first of one is from John Locke, which is property rights. And so property rights have a civilizing effect to them, right? Now they may stratify society, but that in and of itself provides a civilizing force, or at least that's the theory. Okay, under that particular social contract. The other civilizing force is let's say economic wars versus warfare war.
Yep.
Okay. And so we can look at that and say, well, we fight these battles on the world economic stage versus we fight these in trenches, right? And so, maybe that's a definition of modernity that everybody can think about.
Absolutely, and it's my understanding, and I hope to have another friend of mine as a guest on here who is just an expert at international relations and international law. But I learned from him that It was only recently that in terms of international law, the nations agreed that war is no longer an acceptable way to settle your disputes. What that means is the inverse was war was an acceptable legal way to settle disputes. If you couldn't work it out, you would go to war, just like you used to be able to have a duel. There were rules and laws. You could have a duel, right? The Hamilton popularized the idea, the musical play Hamilton, brought that back into consciousness. People used to have duels, and that was a way of settling dispute. I challenge you to a duel. One of us will kill each other, and that's how we'll settle our dispute.
Yeah. Commercial break now.
Yep. Okay.
In a world increasingly disoriented and lacking spiritual values, many are turning to religion as a source of inspiration and comfort. Each person chooses their individual path, and if there is one thing we are known for, it's providing a positive platform for diverse points of view, to provide each of us the opportunity to discern truth for ourselves. Something or Other Publishing is proud to announce the creation of Royal Falcon Press imprint, to feature the unparalleled talent of multiple writers who will bring uplifting and thought-provoking contributions to the body of religious literature, offering current spiritual insights and practical solutions to the challenges we face. Let's grow together as one of the most substantial spiritual communities on the internet. Register and explore a new way to achieve universal wisdom and reinforce your faith with all the surprises Royal Falcon Press has in store for you.
That's good video. Good.
And thank you to Something or Other Publishing, our sponsor, one of our sponsors, for producing the video, sponsoring the show. And there's a QR code. You can learn more about it. You can submit an idea and get involved in Royal Falcon Press.
Don't scan me, because you're not going to get anything if you take a picture of me. So I'll move over there.
I'd like to also just, while we're at it, share this comment from A.M. Sterling that she posted earlier in the show, her view, her understanding, her definition of religion. Thank you for that. We're going to now jump back into the pre-recorded interview with our pre-recorded guest, Norlin Dimmitt, where we left off when I so rudely interrupted the pre-recorded video before. Here we go.
Since you say that, though, the without God, because I was raised by a Christian Marxist, a devout Christian who was a devout Marxist. So Christian Marxism is not an oxymoron. It appears to be so because you have to jettison that one false statement by him that there is no such thing as spirituality. And once you jettison that, you can be a Christian, a Muslim, or anything else, and a Sufi mystic and say, yeah, I believe in the shared pooling of resources for the collective good.
Agreed. As a fundamentalist, who looks at the Word of God and understand that its spiritual significance is rooted in literal physical examples. I do believe that the principles that were brought by Moses include land ownership. I believe that you can derive from the Bible and other religious texts that land ownership is allowed, and that in fact that the land is viewed biblically as an inheritance for the peoples of the planet. How we apportion that, how we manage that is important, but to disenfranchise individuals from that millennial view of every man shall sit under his own fig tree. The millennial view, the 1,000 years of peaceful reign on earth under Jesus Christ, the classic view of the millennium. Jesus establishing the kingdom of God on earth and overseeing 1,000 years of peace. That image, that picture, which is pictured by the Sukkoth celebration, the 7 days of the Feast of Booths, right? The Feast of Tabernacles. Every man would sit under his own fig tree. That includes the idea of ownership. It's yours. You have that personal security. It doesn't belong to the state. It doesn't belong to the church. It is yours. What do we mean on this show when we use the term religion? And what we don't mean with family values is that you don't care about society. That we could have a separate definition about family values. But again, important to how we use terms on this show.
One of the byproducts of a pious family is that you love your community and your family.
Absolutely, because Jesus' statement is very clear on that matter. Jesus said, why do you claim to love God whom you have not seen, right? There's the unverifiable. Anyone can claim to love God. And since God is in his essence unknowable, right? Nobody can invalidate your claim that you love God. You can make that be whatever you want it to be. But it's a little bit harder to invalidate, show disrespect to your brother whom you have seen and have somebody not call you on it, right? So Jesus' statement is, you say you love God whom you've not seen, but look at how you treat your brother who's right in front of you. That's one statement. And then James, who said, show me your faith apart from works, and I will show you faith by my works. Luther didn't like this with his, forgiveness only credo, right? Nothing except faith in Jesus is needed. Only your faith in Jesus is needed. That's why he called James an epistle of straw, because James said, no, I will prove my faith by my works. You can claim to have all the faith you want. If you want to prove it, then, bend down and wash the feet of your brother, whatever that means in modern parlance.
People that see me on this show and see me publicly, they can see the motivation in me trying to bring these concepts together. And the response from an atheist that would say, yeah, but. So now,
yeah, but I'm
going to say they're not making an ass of themselves. But we don't need religion for that. What's in there? There's an implicit admittance that is something of good, and there's really the commonality.
So by saying we don't need religion for that, they're suggesting that something is good in religion?
No, I'm saying they're saying they agree with what you've said, but they don't need religion for that. Right. So if you imagine those words written out, say erase the we don't need religion part for that, and the two parties agree that this is a good thing.
Well, so I'd love your take on that, Norlin. I would love your take on that, Norlin, given your prior definition of religion.
Sure, no, exactly. So this goes back to Christopher Hitchens' book. It parses this debate in terms that get us to exactly where Daniel's going there, which is to say, why are we distracting ourselves with the right number of angels that can actually dance on the head of a pin when the end result of this is notions like solidarity, communitarianism, common good, these Catholic social teaching, just to bring some principles in from that, focusing on the community level instead of having outsourcing compassion to the federal government. All of these values that an atheist and a conservative Catholic can agree on are in fact things that the Catholic Church itself says we ought to walk hand in hand if this atheist is on the right side of this issue and homelessness. Yep, we can walk with them. And that's a very important principle. It's not played out very well by most people in most organized religions, but it's at least a principle worth attending to, is that the good, yes, it may be God is good and good all emanates from God if that's your theological stance. But if we remove God from the equation, that does not invalidate the goodness of the common goal that we have to end homelessness, as an example.
Damn it, it's coming from this atheist.
So
stop me
I want to
swear. Mid swear word.
Well, what I want to do is he mentioned a concept, outsourcing those.
I love that. Yes.
Outsourcing compassion, right? And so the role of religion in society as it plays out in current America, and which is I'm not remotely saying we are where we should be. I think this is a moment of opportunity to discuss these two competing ideas. But those who would say we need less government and we need more religion often say that it is the churches and it is the individuals that have to provide the charity one-on-one. And a part of me really believes in this. When I was over in India trying to get a foundation going for homeless children, because it was easier to go do that kind of thing over there versus do it here in litigious America, where every time you try to help somebody here in America, you can get in trouble. It's therefore, easier and better to sort of outsource it to the state, where the individual doesn't have to get his hands dirty and potentially be accused of this or that, or do something in a slightly wrong way with an intent to help, and end
Mm.
up bankrupt or incarcerated as a result of it. These are the societal issues. How do we balance that out between the idea that you can outsource it and let the state do it, where Canada, for example, is further down that path, and with success, right? You're up in Canada, you experience all the time how the socialist state of Canada, much like what I experienced in Sweden, is more mature and more advanced in having the state provide some of those things. But then at the same time, many Americans are afraid of the further erosion of the family when you're not as dependent on having a healthy, stable, traditional family to deliver that kind of protection and benefits, for example. So, where is the balance in that? Where's the wisdom in that balance of not outsourcing it to the state? Whereas as individuals, we're weak, we're sometimes foolish, and yet, the individual social worker and the heart of somebody who wants to reach out and help his brother is at the core of making anything work.
You're confusing me on a couple levels, Wade, because I intuitively look at it and I think there should be less, say, like governmental outsourcing of compassion, right? Okay, that seems to be the feeling that I have, right? And I got your point that people are scared, individuals are scared because of the litigious nature of North America, and more so in the United States. What's confusing is that I want to make the stand that if we empower more individual agency, we're actually empowering people to do more for their fellow citizen. And I, for many years, have thought that this is just a bizarre thing, that you actually teach your children to step over homeless people. And the rationale, the reason that we do that is we say, well, there's places for them. There's organizations that know how to deal with them better than we do.
So that's a great example. I was actually going to go to the example that came up in the pre-recorded session about the church parking lot, but I like this example better. So let's stick with that example. As a fundamentalist, as a literalist, okay, let's take that example. So you're teaching your children to step over homeless people, and the rationale is there are places for them. Okay, so that's bad, obviously. What's good? What does good look like in that situation? Especially in a place like Los Angeles, right? Or other cities where you've got tent cities of, potentially dangerous people, or the recent subway situation where you had a person who was murdered on a subway. I don't know if you heard about this, but it's a big thing right now because he's being arraigned on murder, where the person who has, kind of a homeless, maybe perhaps some mental illness, has been riding the subway for years, but now he apparently was becoming dangerous, and somebody intervened to protect somebody else against this person, and now that person is being accused of murder, right? It can get very messy, and when you have children involved and you're walking down a street in Los Angeles that has a homeless tent city, what, you're not teaching them to step over the homeless people? What are you teaching them to do then in that situation?
I don't know. It's just I got to focus on that word that we're outsourcing and we're institutionalizing it, and where I have to stop at that, not making any assertions. Although there's no real such thing as a presuppositional thought. It's that I'm uncomfortable with it. I'm uncomfortable with the fact that there's visually right in front of me suffering, and I can't or shouldn't do anything about it, and it's like it's programmed to me that I have to leave it.
We all have that experience, but what do we do about it? What do we?
Yeah,
it feels wrong because it is wrong, right? Because we know at an intrinsic level, the teachings of every great religion, which is when one of us suffers, we all suffer.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're feeling. We're feeling the truth of that statement. When one suffers, we all suffer, right? And the question that the disciples posed of Jesus, well, who is my brother, right? Is like, be your brother's keeper. Well, who is my brother, right? Well, everybody is your brother.
Yeah.
But I can't help everybody. And even if there were just 100 individuals and I was asked to help one of those 100 individuals, there would be a bunch of them that I don't have the capacity to help. I don't have the awareness, the understanding, the technical experience, or the skill to handle an addict versus a mentally ill person versus a handicapped person versus a person with dementia. My wife is a physical therapist. She can help those kinds of people.
So there, we're now flipping over to that, and we say, well, she's the expert. She represents the expert, and it does. It sits well. It does make sense. And what we say is that we want to have all of our individual freedoms and the ability to act on our compassionate impulses, and yet there's a perfect example of it's institutionalized because there's a profession for that.
Well, and it gets very much Alice in Wonderland very quickly because my wife, she's a doctor of physical therapy, very skilled in evidence-based therapy and medicine, or treatment rather. And she'll be the first to tell you that you can give somebody a new knee, $60,000, $80,000, $100,000 surgery, give them a new knee. And if that person does not do their exercises, which they themselves must do, nobody else can do it for them. They can come to her and she can manipulate the leg. She can do massage around the leg. She can work on overall posture. She can give tips about how to walk with the leg. But if that person does not use that leg properly and exercise it, they will be in worse shape than they were before, right? And that's on the person. That's on the individual. It has to do with them. Nobody else can do that for them, right? And furthermore, we know of 2 people who were given 2 knee replacements, one of whom is younger and didn't do the exercises and is worse off, one of whom is older and should have never been given those knee replacements because she is worse off now than she was before she had them. And the total cost to society was probably a couple of $100,000 to make that person worse off than they were. But this view of compassion was that, well, how can we deny this person who wants to have these knees replaced the gift of those knee replacements? Well, they made her worse, and they were going to make her worse no matter what, at her age and her situation and her condition. But now you have the bias of, perhaps a profit motive in there somewhere of, wanting to sell those surgeries and the machine. Anyway, we're down 100 different paths now but this is really critical in terms of the role of religion in society. And getting back to Angela's comment here, something that we should think long and hard about. I love Norland's definition. We'll get back to the pre-recorded session with Norland here shortly. I love his definition, but this adds something to it. Religion is the application of revelation to human interaction. What this presupposes is that there is a divine physician, a divine physician who will prescribe the remedy needed for humankind at that stage in its development. What Adam brought with the 2 trees, even what Noah brought with his preaching about the ark, related to certain behaviors and certain what Abraham brought about monotheism, what Moses brought about law, what Jesus brought about forgiveness. These were religious people would believe. These were physicians' prescriptions for humankind at that stage in their development, the application of revelation. So these thorny problems that we just mentioned, the problems that we're facing right now about what do we do about this knee surgery thing? What do we do in Canada about euthanasia, right? The issue of euthanasia. What is true north? How do we manage that? It's potentially, I've been reading a little bit, it's a potentially a huge problem. The role of religion in society is to inspire, but also to inform and perhaps to assist people get on the same page on some of these issues, to have a common understanding, a common viewpoint, a common lens through which to address and approach the problems that they're facing as a society and as individuals.
What do you
I
think
said
about
16 mouthfuls there. What's your reaction to all this?
I would love to unpack the euthanasia thing because I just would.
Okay.
But what I'm curious about is whether we can run through the last 8 minutes of this with Norlin and then just keep, because I really would like to ask you about that. I think it would be a stumbling block for me, is about the doctor-assisted suicide idea.
Yep. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get back to Norlin. But before we do, why don't we take the opportunity to go to another quick commercial break? We haven't done enough of them. And as soon as we get back from this break, we will, and it's apropos, speaking of Revelation, here's one of the authors from Something or Other Publishing in the Royal Falcon Press imprint area. So for our viewers, whether there is a link below or not, this QR code will serve the same purpose. Please do support the program if you're enjoying it. And, now and then you might want to go ahead and purchase one of the products that are being offered to help us all keep up our faith and believe that ultimately, this will be sustainable, what we're doing here. So, with that, Dan will jump right back into the pre-recorded session with Norlin Dimmitt, you and me, and we'll let it run to the end.
But so the whole point here really does boil down to it's an either or, right? I mean, either I am my brother's keeper or I'm not. You can't say, well, I'm half my brother's. You can, but it doesn't carry much water to either side of the debate. So you either are your brother's keeper or you are not. The difference between individualism and communitarianism, libertarianism in its political form, and communitarianism is precisely that debate of saying that, no, I am my brother's keeper, and we collectively, that the well-being of the community matters. And when it matters, it needs to be a commitment that the community makes, even if it's not 100% buy-in, and there needs to be a democratic process so there's some legitimacy to the community decision-making. But ultimately, the community has to come together. The church can't be asked to make up for where the community has failed.
I think I keep coming back to libertarianism, and the idea is that as a progressive, I want to fight that, and I want to fight that tendency and that urge to I constantly want to throw Ayn Rand under the bus, right? Okay. Mm-hmm. But here's the thing, is that I keep coming back to it, and I keep thinking that it represents individual freedoms, something of which I see that Wade preaches, so that I fundamentally agree with. So what I feel is that what we've just described between the three of us means that it somehow has inhibited my ability to do good work because of the restrictions that have been put on us from society. And I like the way Norlin had said, Well, it's inciting civil disobedience. Yes, and in the right context, it's absolutely essential. That's our God-given right to do that. And you can throw me in jail, you can persecute me, but that's the cross that I bear in terms of that is the weight of the world on my shoulders. And either I accept that or I don't accept that. And I'm not coming from that as a person of faith. I'm coming at that from somebody who acknowledges the wisdom in those words and in that thinking and in that thought. So what I'm actually advocating is a natural form of religious manifestation, or the wisdom that comes out of those words. I say that that's not good enough answer to say that there's a problem with the state, because that's putting the state above something natural.
There's just an interesting dynamic here about ultimately getting justice by working within the system. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and the holy angels with him, he will then sit on the throne of his glory. This is the millennium, the 1,000 years of peace. All the nations will be gathered before him. So now we're talking at the national level. And what is a nation? It is a political organization of human behavior, right? Not a religion, it's a nation. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. And he will set the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. We've covered this before on the show. As we get into this, we find out that these nations are being judged on whether or not they deliver these basic human rights that have become enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is at the United Nations level, the standard by which we are judging these things. Now, the world community does not yet have a model of enforcement. The point is, though, at the national level of this situation of the homeless gathering at the church parking lot, what this verse says to me is that when Jesus returns, which I believe he has, he will judge the nations based on those basic fundamental human rights, because the nations themselves has set that up as the standard of judgment. They have said these basic universal human rights are the standard for any nation. A nation must deliver these things. So the title of this show, Created in the Image of God, what is the role of religion in society? Religion must inspire, not coerce. What must religion inspire? Religion must inspire the people to establish a government. The hills have been leveled. The mountains have been leveled. The kings have been dethroned. The dictators have been dethroned. We have democracies today. Now, we're not there. We're not perfect. There's oligarchies. There's all kinds of systemic problems. But the basic organizational structure of democratic nations, which are elected by the people, who therefore are subservient to governments of their own creation, those nations will be judged by whether or not they are delivering a glass of water to the thirsty, food to the hungry, clothing for the naked, basic human rights related to imprisonment or punishment for crimes, basic human rights related to people who are disadvantaged, i.e. sick. Did you visit me when I was sick? Did you visit me in prison? Is your basic motivation when you invite me to come live in your parking lot to help me get out of that trailer? Or are you using me as a political pawn for your political purposes to stay in power? All of these things are implied by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the judgment will come upon entire nations based on when they are delivering this. So judgment from God and the Son of Man returning in his glory is no longer on an individual, but judgment is being passed on entire nations according to the prophecies of the Bible and the major religions of the world.
The measure of the goodness of a nation, of a country, is how it treated the least of these, how it treated those that were at the bottom. And so that's a different statement of that, and that's a secular statement. And that's my preference would always be.
Was it really a secular statement, or was it informed by religion?
You can't really have foster genuine integrity if you are violating integrity, the integrity of the individual, in virtue of the imposition of values that they are not yet ready to truly authenticate internally.
Well,
and that's the
so in your statement of beliefs, it it has to go beyond faith in Jesus. It has to go beyond, I have a personal relationship with Jesus, right? The formulation of our statements of belief that define our religion should in fact include some measurable criteria, which is why for me the Christian covenant and the signs of the great religions, right? The sign of the Abrahamic religion was circumcision, right? A very painful thing. You wouldn't want to become, as a male, a member of the Abrahamic religion, because that's a deeply personal, painful thing, unless you were serious about it. With Moses, it was keeping the seventh-day Sabbath. With Jesus, it was, by this shall every man know, or all men. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, right? So an independent, outside, third-party observer, an atheist, if you will, gets to decide whether or not you are a Christian. Jesus said, by this shall all men know. An independent, outside, third-party observer gets to judge you that you are my disciples. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another. Me and you claiming we love each other because we belong to the same church doesn't cut it with Jesus. An outside independent observer has to agree. And so this criteria of, well, are you as a pastor bringing people into your parking lot or not and granting them homeless? That's a valid question as to whether you truly are a follower of Jesus.
Wow. It was an intense, fun conversation, actually.
Well, and it comes back to that heart and hand, right? Deeds of stainless purity, it talks about in the Baha'i faith, are the only thing that matters. Anybody can profess whatever they want in terms of their beliefs. People can ascribe to communism, but does it deliver these human rights? People can ascribe to libertarianism, but does it deliver these human rights? People can ascribe to Marxism or capitalism, free market economies. Do they deliver these basic human rights? That is the standard that we set up as a planet, I believe, in fulfillment of that prophecy in Matthew. I believe that's where we're at. That's just my personal take on it. For anyone else to decide, I don't hear anyone complaining that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a bad thing. And the important thing, as I've mentioned, is that the book of Matthew talks about judge not, lest ye be judged. Whatever standard of judgment you apply, that's how you will be judged. So then later, ergo, since the Bible is coherent, since the words of the Bible have integrity, in my opinion, I believe this is verifiable, I believe we can prove it. Therefore, later in the book of Matthew, or as an author, right, and working with Something or Other Publishing, there's this kind of maxim about fiction writing, right? When you describe the room in the opening scene and there above the mantelpiece is a gun. And if you're going to take the time to mention the gun, that gun had better come into play sometime during the story, or you're not a good writer. Why otherwise mention that there was a gun there, right? And people, we've gotten ever more complex in these Netflix series that go on for 7 seasons and every detail intricately woven together. Well, the Bible is like that. It is not coincidence that the opening statements of Jesus in Matthew 7 are all about judgment and how we should judge and not judge. And whether even you believe it's divinely inspired, the author was a good author by working this theme into the book. And the theme of judgment and how you're judged and why you're judged based on the standard of how you judge others. Ergo, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the standard of judgment that the nations have applied to themselves, giving God justification to judge them in that same way. When judgment comes upon the nations for failing to deliver the basic human rights, they will be without excuse before the divine authority, before the divine judge. The divine judge is justified in applying judgment when you yourself have said, yes, this is how we should be judged.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, and So, like, let's take this conversation that seems to have ended in aporia, which is a term that we see in philosophy and in the dialogues. It just means like we don't get an answer from it, right? So let's take the United States, which, by the way, in any social science study is the quintessential individualistic sample baseline, whatever you want to call it. The U.S. population represents the population that defines the maximal amount of individual freedoms, more so than anything that we've ever achieved in human history. Okay, that's
At that
that's a
scale.
fact. That at that scale, that is a fact. Now, when
it's done that through this complex federalized model, right? At that scale.
So what I'm curious about is, like, and I'm just spitballing some ideas around here, but if you look at communism, which sounds great, everybody gets a bit, equal share, right? Okay, so everybody gets an equal bit
to each, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, or something like that, right?
Right. So how do you then, according to the judgments or the Declaration of Human Rights and Freedoms, how do you ensure that for the maximal amount of people? Now, I'm putting a utilitarian piece in there, which has it has its own problems. But if we're just saying the maximum amount of people are going to be saved, if you will, or they're gonna receive those freedoms, and that's the mechanism for judgment. You tell me, what is the best way to do that? Intuitively, like, I mean, is it through a communist structure, or is it through a
the theory again Marxist theory, right, is that, and communist theory is that eventually the government just disappears, right? You know, those communist
absolute power
posters, right?
So they won't
but
leave,
that was the
won't.
theory, right? This is my point. Whether you call it utilitarian or not,
yeah.
You know, on this show we often refer to the Garden of Eden as, certainly it's a useful story for those who don't believe in it. There's this story about how human civilization began. You know, the first two people, and they had children, and one of them killed each other. And then you have this growth and development and all the School of Hard Knocks and all the lessons learned on down to our day. We used to play those videos in some of our early shows from that project. I forget what the name of it was, but you know, that map that out in great terms. We should revisit one of those videos one of these days. Fast forward, you know, to whatever, how many billion people we are today, and how 300 million Americans in a complex federalized model, right? And you had the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the United States of America, two models of a federated system. And I've gone into this in my final book, The Rod of Iron, about the space race and what I believe it symbolizes in terms of biblical prophecy. But you had these two grand experiments of global domination. Which one? And then in the mix, you had Hitler, right? Which one of these models is the right one for the world? And again, when I went to Europe and as an adult and lived and worked there, and I ended up in the Soviet Union during Gorbachev's abduction. At that time in Europe, I was vaguely anti-American. I was more a socialist than I was a capitalist. Again, going back to those early childhood experiences and the fact that I saw how socialist systems have a degree of inherent compassion that is lacking in the more detached, hands-off systems of free market economies, right? I ideologically embraced socialist models because to me, they represented the ability to deliver care and compassion at a societal level. I've since changed my thinking, and that moment in Leningrad was critical. when these Russians could not understand why the satellite nations would not return to Mother Russia, because their hatred was so deep. Why was their hatred of a system that promised to deliver peace, prosperity, benefits, wealth for all in a loving, caring, kind?
But we know that wasn't the. I mean,
Well, but that was the theory. That was the utopian vision behind it. But it failed. It was bankrupt. The grand petri dish of the Soviet Union proved to not deliver the culture. And it wasn't just the Soviet Union, it was Cambodia. We also see it in China. We see it in
China, yeah.
other nations which are using these theories, these ideas, these, you might say, religious principles, even though there's not a God involved, but these utopian visions of how society should be structured, they don't work.
Mhm.
Now, we know that the capitalist Western societies, and there's a lot of science that today purports to show how it also doesn't work and it's not sustainable, right? The Western model is driving the world to global annihilation through climate change. Oh, really? Because who's the world's greatest polluter? Pray
You're going to bring
tell.
up China at that point,
Who's
right?
the
Or China
who's
or-
the world's most destructive society in terms of the nations or the world's oceans? Which nation is destroying vast tracts of the ocean and the fishing habitats on which we depend? Is it the free market economies of the West? No, it's not. Again, it's China. It's China on both of those counts. So that utopian vision, that visionary socialist model, is not delivering on any of the criteria
Well, yeah,
that we
it's
might
interesting.
establish.
My take on that was that I and people that have listened to my opinions on the show before, they understand that I'm on the climate side of the equation, right? And
And in this discussion, I am too. I'm saying, okay, climate change is happening, but which nation is the most egregious violator? That's the premise is, yes, climate change, science, it's all true.
yeah, but it
Which
starts
nation-
to frame the conversation as punitive, right? That's how, and I'm saying, is there a better way to approach it rather than, because if you do dig deeper, you also find that a lot of what a lot of what the U.S. gets is from China. They produce a lot of the goods that, so we've put a lot of, North America.
Fair enough. But the premise of Matthew 25 is punitive. These nations will be judged. It's punitive, right? They will be asked to come to terms with the fact that they have not delivered the human rights.
Right. So then maybe the right thing should have been, yes, we would love to take all these contracts to give you cheap disposable products, but unfortunately we know that's not good for the long term. So thanks, but no thanks. We would rather just stay the way we are, right? It still does nothing to elevate people out of poverty.
But no, right. I moved from that model of human rights to the model of climate change to illustrate, if we take a completely different frame of reference and we say that delivering a sustainable ecological system is now the standard, not human rights, because many people who are advocates of doing something serious about climate change, they want to take away all kinds of human rights, right? They want to take away all your human rights. They want to force you to eat bugs. They want to force you to live in a city that has, no cars and which you can't travel more than 15 minutes. I'm exaggerating for caricature effect, but you get my point. I shifted the frame of reference. I shifted the standard of judgment away from human rights towards climate change is going to destroy the planet. Which system is delivering better results? And again, who is the worst violator? And the other socialist so socialist nations of Europe, they're on the gold standard. But the communist nations, right? They're not helping anything, they are rapidly becoming the most egregious. And I don't know how we would frame India in this context. They're also an egregious polluter. What I'm getting at, Dan, is
Mm.
the reference to Matthew is a standard by which the nations can be racked and stacked and judged. I believe
Yeah.
that the human rights is the right measurement, not climate change. And therefore, human rights trump climate change, in my opinion. Although you also have to deliver clean water to people. You also have to deliver food to people. And so a sustainable environment is important. But you can't kill them all in the name of human rights because you believe that that's the best thing to save the planet.
I think you'd really get along with Bjorn Lomborg because he's very much on the and then the Jordan Peterson of the world, right? It's like, there's nothing in the data, according to Jordan Peterson, that shows that we actually have a plan with the climate change paranoia, right? And I'm kind of paraphrasing his position, right? So, and therefore, the Bjorn Lomborg position comes in and says, what we need to do is spend our money and our resources wiser, and we can do more good for more people by doing things to relieve malaria or clean drinking water or 100 things before we go and spend $1 trillion on trying to mitigate carbon in the atmosphere, right? So, I don't really agree with that, but I think it's a position that's gathering some momentum, I guess, right? Funny, I mean, the ironic thing about we will be judged with that's the scripture of Matthew, right? Okay, is that we don't live in a reality of counterfactuals. So it's not like I can and the pandemic was a perfect example. It's like, well, if we take this pathway and we end up with X number of deaths, I can't say, well, if we did this other pathway, we would, how do you know that it would have been worse if we did it this way? Like you just, how do you get your head in front of that?
Yeah, the questions are very complex, and the science that is applied to it, again, I believe the science needed doesn't really exist, and it's in its infancy at best, to address these very large systemic issues that involve all these different facets, right? So just to take one simple caricature of it, the masking and the lockdowns, right? How many lives were really saved by them, and how many people died that would not have otherwise died from isolation, from suicide, how much negative impact on the children who were taken out of school for several years. You start adding all that up and it changes the equation, right? And you have people debated on either side, but the science doesn't really exist to answer those questions, in my opinion. The technology doesn't exist to gather all that data and crunch all that data. And then to put in the wild card factor of, well, when you give a 70-year-old woman 2 new knees, maybe she will get some useful life out of those knees, but maybe she won't do her exercise, right? And she'll be worse off, right? There's this wild card factors and that's just at one single level. Now take it as society as a whole, and you start having some global authority issue some edict that must now apply equally to all the nations on the planet. Like carbon, like carbon, whatever, that China is not participating in because China's economy is at a different stage of evolution than the West, or whatever rationale there is.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's really interesting. I guess the one point I was going to make is that from somebody that's trying to advocate for the position and the argument of climate change, that I feel that I've arrived at the place where I see that that's an existential issue, right? So then the point comes to say, well, what do we do about it? How do we How do we affect change? And what I see as a global bias is that we somehow think we're going to get global buy-in to this, and I think that's a non sequitur, because ultimately it's the nations that are going to have to step up, and you say it eventually leads to judgment, right? And I'm like, okay, so this starts to resonate with me a little bit more, because the benevolent dictator of the United States isn't just going to say, oh yeah, you're right, like, we're basically the leader of the free world, the most prosperous country ever that has ever existed on the planet. We're just going to hand it all over and go, yeah, great, there you go. When resource shortages start to occur and people start dying, and there's economies start to fall over and collapse, and there's refugee crisis around the world, and it starts to accelerate, I don't think there's going to be a kumbaya song that's going to unite us all under the United Nations. So my position is more of a practical one. It's not like someone say, well, he's a nationalist. He's I'm like, it's an inevitability. Of course it's going to be the nations. And what are the nations? What do they make up them? We're made up of nations bound by law, held together by people. And so we have to participate within our own nations under the law, and it's going to be different in Canada, and it's going to be different in the United States. But if you start to rob people of their citizenry, then agency disappears, and we're talking about fascism.
Which at the granular level gets back to land ownership and the ability, America was founded on the principle of landowners voting, right? And then that eventually got male landowners, right? And eventually got extended to others, got extended to non-whites, non-white males, women.
Wait, this is why I say there's something called MMT, and I need you to wrap your head around this before we end up talking with Professor Keene, which we're going to do at some point later on in this this network of shows that we're doing. There's something called MMT, and it's presented somewhat like the silver bullet of like, hey, there's endless dollars there. Not really, because it's all tempered by inflation. The issue is that if we as a society, we're going to put our money where our mouth is, and let me step away from climate change and talk about a biodiverse economic system. Okay, so that means we're truly working within the ecology around us. I've talked to climate change deniers that the environmentalists would call deniers, which I think is an unfair characterization. But let's just say I'm talking to the climate change deniers, and I say, well, what about a biodiverse economic system? I'm fine with that. Just don't tell me that there's excess carbon and we need to basically hand over all of our freedoms. So I'm like, oh, bingo. We have one thing that we can agree on, which is we should have an economic system that ties into the biology of our surroundings, our ecosystems, right? So this is sustainability, okay? And that's going to vary by community and by geographical region and on and on and on, right? So if that's the goal, then the global financial system needs to put its money where its mouth is. And if we have a system like MMT that says, hey, we have the money, well then, fuck it, put it in there. Reward people who have and create the biodiverse baseline that we need to live within and thrive. So the entrepreneurial
in other words, to put in practical terms, what you're suggesting is, in the United States, we have something called the New Green Deal, and that's a label that's one-dimensional. I don't want to use it in the political sense at all, but it signifies massive investment in green infrastructure, right? And also disincenting other types of technology, other types of energy that don't meet some of those standards. I mean, is that what you're talking about? In other words, MMT, because money can be fabricated, and because it doesn't matter how much we fabricate, therefore it doesn't matter how much we spend, how much we throw away money like drunken sailors at the things that we want to promote.
There's this fellow by the name of Richard Murphy that was on a show called
I'm just asking,
Stephen Friends.
is that what you're kind of saying, or and I know I'm kind of packing it in language you may not totally approve of, but do you get what I'm asking?
Oh, for exaggeration. So let me swim within that, because I do. I understand what you're trying to say, and if
Because
I can't,
what you're saying is MMT means there's no limit. Money is endless. It's just a fantasy fabrication. We can inject it in endless supply into the economy, and it really doesn't matter.
no, it would have devastating effects if we didn't
Right.
if we didn't use it to the advantage of our society and our cultures. It would be devastating.
Right.
It would break the system.
Who is
right?
smart enough to know that is the essential argument of this so-called free market, right?
Right. That's why I'm saying incentivize the agents. So make the money go directly to the agents, and then they're the ones that go out and do that.
Which agents?
This is agent-based modeling would be individual freedoms.
Okay.
Individuals.
So in other words, but how do you manage that? How do you decide who's a worthy agent?
Well, basically, I think the thing that everybody has to understand about MMT is that they're trying to detach people from the idea that you need to manage your country like you do your household budget, right? Okay. And that's the point where the sophisticated person doesn't understand it, right?
Right.
What's that?
The debt ceiling discussion in America. We have a
debt
ceiling.
Right. Where are we going to get the money? Where are we going to get the money? But my point is that we still live under
it's not where we're going to get the money. I mean, the people that want to impose a debt ceiling don't necessarily disagree that money can be fabricated, right? But they believe that it can have devastating
Who's going to fabricate
effects.
it, and where does it go?
Right.
And how does it devalue
devastating effects if,
exactly.
If this particular president spends another $1.3 trillion on stuff that he wants to spend it on for reasons he wants to spend it, they don't think this president and the next one and the next one, and by the way, where does that stop, especially in a two-party system where one party says, let's go to the left. And then, eventually the results of that become bad enough that the country wants to go to the right. And then eventually the results of that become bad enough. And so we lurch forward from ditch to ditch. But there's a safety valve in the balanced budget that says President Fred, Susie, or Tom, or whatever this president's name is, doesn't get to spend $10 trillion, right? Just because that president thinks he should and wants to. There's a limit to how much that president can spend during his term.
Yeah, but it's still under the balance sheet of an antiquated economic model, which, I mean, we probably need to have a separate conversation for that. But there's this Richard Murphy. He was on a show that I did 3 episodes ago on the Stephen Friends, and he was one of the originators of the Green New Deal. And his words haunt me. He said that this got accelerated and put basically to the forefront of the teleprompter for Obama. And he's like, wow, this is great. I was one of the originators, the people that helped come up with the Green New Deal. I didn't know that it would get so big, but there it is. And you know what? We knew in 2007, these are his words, that there was going to be a financial crisis. And we didn't want to not take advantage of a financial crisis. So
crisis is a terrible thing to waste.
Are you kidding me?
Right.
Yes. I was like, what?
Right.
So there's this like opportunistic tinge with like how to move agenda forward at all costs. Like,
well, and we're all like that to a degree, right? We all would like to see.
We all chase ambulances to get home faster. Is that the way it is?
Well,
oh shit, carpe diem. I mean, I just think it's and when you see it from your side, because I'm saying these are my peeps, right? I'm on the climate change side, and I'm thinking, but is that
Right.
what we do? Is that if I'm against nuclear
Well, there you go.
power, I wait for a reactor to blow, and then I get on a plane and I start.
So the end doesn't justify the means.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Yeah, I think you need to get back to first principles. And I think if we're really going to say that there is money to be able to do what we need to do, then Wade, follow me on this, okay? Then that money should be able to give to people to be able to feed the people that need the food, that give the water to the people that need to do that, to fulfill the you could say it's almost like the prophecies, to fulfill the words of Matthew, to say, we know we're going to be judged by a nation. And if there is this gift of MMT, then we can look at it and say, then that's the baseline. Everybody gets it. Maximal amount. No soldiers left behind. And then what nation gets judged, or that nation that makes those commitments and tries to implement that, is going to be at the top of the heap when it comes to being judged. And if we have an economic system that supports that, but we don't, because we have an economic system that still, the rules of the monopoly game still function differently from the ethics. We have a detachment from the ethics.
Yep.
And that's my point.
No, and well stated. I want to bring this back to the topic of religion. Then I want to deal with a couple of comments, and then bring it to a conclusion for tonight. The bringing it back to religion is this: whether it's a debt ceiling or any other sort of governor on governments, right? A governor, what a governor is when you have your car and it won't let you go more than 120 kilometers an hour, whatever. You have a governor on government. That is one of the roles of religion in society, right?
Is to put a limit. An
this
agreed
far,
upon limit.
This far and no further, whether it, whatever kind of ethics, right? So could we have other things that do that? But recently a criticism was leveled against science. I heard, and I've heard this before, but it was maybe in our conversation with Norland. I don't remember, but science will do it. Whatever it is, science won't stop. They'll say, hey, we could try this. Hey, we could try this. Science will create Frankenstein monsters, because it pursues curiosity, it pursues knowledge, it pursues research. It wants to get at the answers, right? And there's nothing that says stop.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that is another role of religion in society, is that governor, right? And the belief that there will be a reckoning in the afterlife, and that we are bringing ourselves into account based on those ethics, based on those standards. And we can circle back and talk about that more in future shows.
Yeah.
But I want to just acknowledge Steve Eaton's comments here. Parliament of World Religions. I was there a few years ago in Toronto. It's going to be in Chicago this year. A little plug for the Parliament of the World's Religions, a great organization. But then his next comment, I want to sort of end with a question here. When we're forced by awful conditions to value global survival over national agency and sovereignty, we will cross over the watershed. People tend to react most to bad consequences. Unfortunately, we're not quite at the point where we must realize, and the rest of the comment says, realize we must hang together or hang separately. I'm going to challenge that a little bit. I think we are at the point where we realize, I don't think anybody, right or left, up or down, climate true believer, climate denier, I don't think anyone believes that or fails to recognize we must hang together or hang separately. Are we not in an age of utopian visions that are seeking to force everybody to conform to their vision, exactly because they realize we all have to agree? The time for disagreements, fundamental disagreements, is over. We've realized that that warfare is not a legal means of settling disputes, But economic warfare, we also realize, is not a good way of settling disputes. And if it is, one person will pursue economic supremacy at the expense of the planet, right? A nation will pursue economic supremacy at the expense of the planet. Whether or not the leaders of China are actually doing this, critics of China say that's exactly what they're doing. Critics of China say they're adopting a stance and getting the Western world suckered into the Paris Climate Accords exactly so that they can attain economic supremacy, and that this is warfare. And they themselves are attaining economic supremacy at the expense of the entire planet. And the more that, to use your phrase, the benevolent dictator stands down, the worse off we are, because others are pursuing economic hegemony and political hegemony and seeking global dominance. And they may be less benevolent than the United States. This is part of the fundamental argument. And so people realize we have to get our act together as a species. I don't think anyone denies that. The question is how, which again gets back to the topic of the show, the role of religion in society.
Yeah. And from a national standpoint, if it's the benevolent dictator, maybe they need to become not so benevolent and say, this is how it is, and get in line, or I'm sorry. I don't know. I'm not advocating for it, but it's like, when shit gets ugly, then you want the military there, right? When there's no more food in the grocery stores, and there's chaos in the streets, and the local law enforcements are scared to go and do their job. Well, what do you do then?
There's a Talking Head song from the 80s called Nothing But Flowers. Have you ever heard it?
No.
You should listen to it sometime. It's basically, this was pre-climate change, right? It was basically an ecology song, a global ecology song. But David Byrne took a contrarian stance, and he's saying that, the world decided to take down all the 7-Elevens and all the Dairy Queens and plant flowers, and there's nothing but flowers. And he's not happy. He's not happy at all. And he says, as things fell apart, nobody paid much attention, is one of the lines in the song. As things fell apart, nobody paid much attention, right? So getting back to that person who wanted to use the economic, or was thankful that the economic crisis was being used to further the green agenda, you may find that hell is when you have the power to implement your version of heaven. Interestingly, they wrote a song about heaven too. And he's not exactly happy with that either, David Byrne. He says, heaven is a place where nothing ever happens. And he says, and when this kiss is over, it will start again, and it will be exactly the same.
Wade, I think there's wisdom in that, because despite the fact that I publicly refer to myself as a philosopher, I can't, maybe it's the impulse from Plato, but I can't help but try and contrive the best possible solution for all of this mess. And
as we should.
And it, well, as we should. But here's the thing.
That's what we're doing. We're all doing. That's exactly what we're trying to do. But we're doing it in discussion, in dialogue, and in harmony. We're not seeking to impose our view, or impose our vision on others.
But here's my idea, is that the government actually recruits people to live within a climate budget. Okay. And so that means every American, every Canadian would advertise based off of like the average income of the country. So in America, say it's $60,000 a year. So your daughter becomes of age, she's voting age, and she's like, Dad, I can get $60,000 a year by keeping my carbon emissions below this amount, right? And you're like, well, it's all kind of crazy to me, but yeah, go for it. And then your son comes up, and so they all become like official stewards, right? Okay. And if they do want to go and do something like take a plane trip, then it costs an order of magnitude, 10 times the amount that it would normally cost, right? But that's the social contract that they willingly sign up for. Okay.
I think you're gonna end up with bread lines.
With red lines.
Bread.
Oh, bread lines.
Right. In other words, I think you're going to end up with with the results of the communist society, because you're incenting.
Oh, it gets worse. Yeah, no,
you're incenting non-activity.
It gets worse, but you have to say that there's a ton of work to be done in that economy, right? And in that sort of environment. Okay. I know from my standpoint, I would love to do podcasts all day. I'd love to write poetry and philosophy all day. Do I think that's worthwhile? Yeah, but we just don't pay people to do that, right? Okay. So I can make a case for a society that is steeped in the arts, and one that takes the whole ecology of the planet into consideration, right, in their GDP model, right? I can make that case. But here's where my plan gets a little bit worse. And I'm realizing that our ability to kind of come up with a plan, like you said, it may be creating my own worst, my hell on earth. Okay, so here's the problem where it becomes an issue: is that retirement age in America is probably what, 65? Something like that.
It's actually
right?
America. The model is
70.
You can retire early and you get less. You can work longer and you get more. So it's retirement age in America is when you decide within a range of anything between 62 to 70 is generally retirement.
Right?
Yeah.
Then after that period of time, essentially you live off of like personal savings and maybe something that naturally comes from the government, right? So
Social Security. It's called.
Okay, so Social Security. So Canada has something similar. Now I'm saying you crank that age all the way down, right? And you enforce government conscription of our youth. You make them go and participate in in the army or in the armed forces. You teach them how to do engineering. You get them to do practical on the ground disaster recovery relief. Like, they are the ones actually making and putting the food into the grocery stores, right? But we don't have to keep working until we're into all the way to our 70s, because it's that production centric mentality that keeps producing and producing and producing needless, unnecessary product, right? So, but you got to put your money where your mouth is, and the people on the environmental side just don't put their money where their mouth is. They're saying, well, let's take all this away, but there's always going to be the incentive on that side that you still have to pay your bills, and that's the reality of the system. So if that system doesn't change, you're never going to get people to buy into it in terms of a democracy, right? And so that simply is it from a first principle standpoint. You have to make it so that it's appealing to the majority of the population, and then motivate the population to do what they have to do to keep that together.
Yeah, and the premise or first principle of one of the first principles of this show is it must inspire, not coerce, right? So people have to want to sign up for it. And in any case, I want to, speaking of people wanting to sign up for it, we've got to sort of bring the conversation to a conclusion for tonight, at least for the live show. We've innovated a little bit with our pre-recorded segments, and just you and I. We haven't had as many endorsements, advertisements. We'll skip those, but I think we do need to bring it to a close. So we will continue to try to further define religion as it applies to this show. Thank you, Carl. Great to see you here. And we should have you on the show sometime, because I know you have a depth of experience and research in some of these topics. And thank you so much for joining tonight. So I would like to bring this topic up again of the definition of religion as we mean it, because we had a couple of different inputs. I don't think we, even with all the discussion, really got there. And I want to arrive at a definition that is useful for repeated use on the show, that we can all agree on. And from there, we can begin to build, I believe, Dan, on some of those principles, and perhaps put forward the idea that you mentioned and other ideas from people in the audience, and then test them against the main
I think we had
thesis
it,
and
Wade.
premise of the show.
I think
Yep.
we had the originally modified version of definition that we had
Did you write it
added
down?
with your.
Yeah.
Well, we'd have to go back, but
Yeah.
then the
Okay.
civilized piece, right, which was the wisdom of the Baha'i faith. It says this
Okay.
was it has a civilizing force that impregnates the role of religion. And I hate to say it, it's like, oh, all my like atheist friends don't listen to that, but you know, the thing is I'm like, okay, that's the agreement. You say, is there a civilizing aspect to it? Okay, and is that the role of religion? Is to, in hindsight, in 1,000 years, in 10,000 years, you could say that started a force that civilized society. Okay, now I can say that about Jesus and about Christianity. It had a civilizing effect. It had
even in anthropology, right? Göbekli Tepe, in which it has been posited now by scientists doing that kind of deep historical archaeological research that they believe they've proven that religion was the organizing force behind society, not the other way around, based on excavations at Göbekli Tepe. We might want to explore that at some future episode. We could maybe bring in Eileen.
But how do you detangle that from the Enlightenment, though? Because like it's literally changed and shaped the world that we live in, and that civilizing force of the Enlightenment, does it have some of the same effects of a religion? Enlightenment values.
As a Baha'i, I would say the primal point of the Enlightenment was May 23rd, 1844, when the Bab declared his mission. And he brought us back after the decline of the and I apologize to my Muslim friends here, the decline of the revelation of Muhammad, in which we ended up with some of the more aberrant forms of Islamism which dominate today. But there was a new breath of life, a new impulse that was brought into humanity around the Enlightenment, and it was because God had sent another manifestation to bring that light into the world, and that this will be realized in hindsight, that that's where it came from. What are the tokens of that?
Is that we just don't see a long enough time scale to be able to see what you're talking about.
Exactly.
And I'm not agreeing with you, but I'm trying to understand it. And I think that
so as a philosopher, as a historian, at what point in history did people begin to realize that Jesus was a civilizing force? The Romans certainly didn't believe it. The Jews certainly didn't believe it.
400 to 600 years after his birth, right? When it started to get codified into a canon and put on in a written format.
So when would you say the Enlightenment arose?
I think Francis Bacon, probably.
16 what? Was he 1690 or something?
He's kind of like around Shakespeare kind of time period, I believe.
Which is, for the ignorant among us, what?
Well, there's the ignorant among us, but there's also the philosopher that has the crappy memory.
Don't have the date on the tip of their tongue, right?
I think Shakespeare died in 1566. So let's look that up.
I'm looking up Francis Bacon right now. That's a more direct look at it, right? Oh wow, 1561, 1626.
Yeah. So, well, let's do even better to ask the Google Oracle. Okay, when was the Enlightenment?
The father of empiricism, right? Is empiricism? Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, just like, like
scientific
let's look
thought.
at. Yeah, so 1685 to 1815 was the Enlightenment and Enlightenment values, right?
Well, there you go. Right. So in Baha'i terms, the dawn, right? The Enlightenment is when the sun begins to shine over the horizon, but it has not yet risen, right? And so what we see, thus 1844, right, came right after the Enlightenment, right, where it peaked above the horizon.
Right. So
And-
could you use the
and I
metaphor for the Bob? The Bob's like the metaphor that eventually it'll get high enough and get to the apex of the sky, like more metaphor than.
It gets more complex than that, because in the Baha'i faith you have the twin manifestations of the Bab and Baha'u'llah, and for the first time in human history, you have in very close proximity the sun rising twice. And so Baha'u'llah declared his mission in 1863.
Mhm.
And the zenith of his, which the end of the prophetic cycle came with the arrival of the Bab. He completed the prophetic cycle. The Muslims would say Muhammad was the last prophet, right? The seal of the prophets. The prophetic cycle is over, but a new cycle has dawned, which Baha'is believe will go on for the next 500,000 years, which will continue to have these messengers from God who will guide mankind on its path at, roughly speaking, 1,000-year
It's
intervals.
not fair, I don't think.
What isn't fair?
Well, I mean, like so they're all sitting around, right? You know, you got Abraham sitting there, and then you've got Jesus, and and then the Bob comes walking in, and he's like, "Yeah, I got 500,000 years, you poor guy."
No, not the
You got
Bob. It's
1,000.
no, not the Bob. Only got 19 years, right? He only got 19
years,
right?
Okay,
From
well,
1844 to 1863. It's
who
Baha'u'llah.
gets this? Like, Baha'u'llah gets 500,000 years. Like, that's not fair.
But see, it's fair because Adam introduced the Adamic cycle, and we would not say that Adam only lived 6,000 years ago, but that Adam was really.
Wait a minute. They're out there, right? 6,000 years,
of course. Well, I'm not here to really say one way or another, but I would say that at least symbolically, Adam points to the time when that spark of intelligence and perhaps the word, language. When do we think, in terms of anthropological and historical terms, when did language enter in? When did humans, Homo sapiens or Neanderthals, or when did they begin to use language? I don't know.
Well, yeah, I mean, of course, the Google Oracle would be great for that, but this is where you have like a working thesis. So I would say a working thesis would be the language that we can most relate with started.
It says here 200,000 years ago, right? So my point being, when you say it's not fair, well, the Adamic cycle would have begun perhaps with the origin of speech, when man gave names to the animals, right? When he began to name things. Wouldn't that be the dawn of empiricism, really, right? When you began to name animals? I don't know. What does empiricism even mean? I don't know. But the Adamic cycle is what we compare the cycle of Baha'u'llah to, because the Adamic cycle was the beginning of the prophetic cycle. When
he's still 2.5 times, man. I'm telling you, he's still like the king of the castle there, right?
Here it says 300,000 years ago. So
it's getting closer. You're tightening it up a little bit,
right,
but
exactly.
Well, you could also say the metaphor works the other way, and it's really like space and time gets kind of like shrunk down to like it ends up being like 20 minutes or something.
A day with God is like 1,000 years, right? So
yeah, that's right.
I'm gonna say thank you to the viewers who we still have with us, and there are some, and you
they
guys
have.
are
We actually climbed in the last. It's like I think maybe right at the hour mark it starts to.
They went and had some lunch or dinner, and they came back and said, "These guys still at it." Anyway,
still on, yeah.
Thank you, everyone who's still here with us. It's been a fun romp through this defining moment to try to define the term religion. So Dan, please go back to Norlin and get that citation so that we can write it down and then add and let's come up with a definition for the next time we do this. But in the meantime, next week we're going to have Cameron back on the show. Cameron, who was here last week, and he's going to talk about individual collectivism. right? Which is
That-
furthering this whole series of discussions
Exactly.
around the
Mhm.
organizing principles of society, how it should be organized. We'll talk to him about what role religion plays in there. He's obviously coming at it from a very unique and interesting perspective. Can we organize our world differently? Individual collectivism holds that when we create systems that help people do better, it benefits society and vice versa. When people do well, society does well. When we invest in people, society benefits as a whole. A failure of anyone is a collective responsibility that we would do well to remedy wherever possible. The golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And am I my brother's keeper? Right? The question that goes back to Adam, whom we were just talking about, and Eve and their first two children, right? Cain and Abel. And Cain, who killed Abel, according to the story, asked the Creator, am I my brother's keeper? And Jesus invoked this thousands of years later. We're still facing this same question today. We haven't resolved it on tonight's show. Perhaps we will next time. We hope you'll tune in. In the meantime, thank you and see you soon.